Nothing sacred about my tests. Come up with your own. My 4 tests are internal consistency, meaning by that, are there contradictions within the text that point to massive confusion? When you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you'll notice a tremendous internal consistency. No contradictions.
Is that really the case, Cliff? The Gospels have no contradictions at all. So today's video is going to be about the contradictions in the Gospels and the New Testament narrative of Jesus' life. Now, this video may come off as an attack on Christianity or the validity of Christianity, but I'm not saying that these contradictions disprove Christianity completely. I just want to make this video to have people know that these things exist in the Bible. These things are real. The Bible is not perfect. It's not perfectly consistent on everything. There's a lot of things that need explanations. There's a lot of things that need answers, and a lot of these contradictions do have answers. A lot of them don't. So I'm just showing these contradictions so we know that the Bible is not perfect in every way, and it has some things that are very questionable. But none of these points completely disprove Christianity. You can't completely dismiss Christianity based off these contradictions. But this video is just to open up perspectives and open up discussion about these contradictions. So a lot of the contradictions that we're going to be talking about, they're going to seem very insignificant, very small. We're going to say, who cares? Why does it matter? But I think Bart Ehrman makes a good point on why these things matter.
Now, many of you are saying, who cares? Well, it's a little detail, but why is it different? It couldn't be both. It couldn't be both. It has to be one or the other or neither. When I'm teaching my New Testament class to my students, I tell them that doing New Testament studies is kind of like doing detective work. A detective's been called on the scene of a crime, and there's a man who's dead in a pool of blood, and the detective starts looking around for little fingerprints and for a strand of hair. And a sensible person would say, what in the world are you doing? There's a dead body here. Why are you looking for a strand of hair? It's because a strand of hair can solve the crime. Sometimes the smallest things are what you need. Sometimes small details in the Gospels that are discrepancies show you something about the Gospels.
Another thing that we need to establish is that the belief that the Bible is perfect and completely inerrant is relatively new. This has not been a thing throughout Christian history, throughout Christian scholarship in any way. It's a very new thing to say that the Bible is perfect. It has no issues, no contradictions. This has not been the view throughout Christian history. So the first contradiction we're going to get into is from the beginning of the Gospels, which is Jesus' genealogy and his father's and his family line, in which Matthew and Luke completely contradict one another.
In both accounts, Jesus has a genealogy. The genealogy in Luke happens to come in chapter 3 after Jesus' birth, which is a strange place for a genealogy, but that's where it is. Luke chapter 3. Read the genealogy in Luke and read the genealogy in Matthew and ask yourself, who is allegedly Jesus' father in both? Well, it's Joseph, okay? Both genealogy traces Joseph's bloodline. And so, who is Joseph's father? It's different in Matthew and Luke. Who's his grandfather? Different in Matthew and Luke. Who's his great-grandfather? Different in Matthew and Luke. The genealogies are different between Joseph all the way back to King David.
So I'm not just going to take Bart Ehrman's word for everything. I'm going to go actually check the Bible myself and see if maybe he has some kind of narrative that he's trying to push. Maybe he has this narrative of the Bible is not inerrant and you shouldn't trust it. So I'm going to go check the Bible myself, and we're going to see if this is true, that the genealogies contradict. Okay, so we have the genealogy of Jesus Christ here. And if we search up David in the word search, we see that David is a part of the genealogy, which is the important one. We want the Messiah to be part of the David's line. But then when we search up other fathers and other people in the genealogy, they don't really match up, like Levi. Levi is only in Luke's gospel. Or Asaph, or Abijah, Josiah, or Azor, Zadok, Joram, Uzziah, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Eliud, Eleazar, Matan, Aboid, Akim, and many others. But you guys can go on this website called Bible Gateway, and you can set up 2 tabs next to each other. Just press Command F or Control F, and just search up the names as you see them on there and see if they match up. So Judah is there. So You just search up the names and see if they match up in each one. Okay, well, so that's a bit weird because you'd think the genealogy is one of the most important things to preserve and make sure is completely consistent in every gospel, which is the establishing of Jesus' rule as the Messiah, which is supposed to come from this specific line of people. You'd think that this thing is going to be perfectly preserved. But I guess there's a lot of contradictions there, and there might be a lot of answers to these contradictions, but the contradictions do raise a question of why they would even have these kinds of contradictions in the first place. But anyways, to the next contradiction. So the next one we have is in Matthew 9 and Mark 5, which is the story about Jairus' daughter. Jairus is a man who comes up to Jesus and says, "I need you to help me save my daughter. My daughter is sick or she's already dead." But depending on which gospel you read, she's either already sick and dying or she's already dead. So in Matthew 9, we get Jairus saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and put your hand on her and she will live." But then in Mark 5, we get, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hand on her so that she will be healed and live." So which is it in the story? Is the daughter already dead or is she dying? But anyways, let's move on to the next contradiction between Mark and Matthew, which is where Jesus says to take a staff on their journey or not to take a staff. So in Mark 6:8, we get Jesus saying, "Take nothing for the journey except a staff. No bread, no bag, no money in your belts. Wear sandals, but not an extra shirt." But then in Matthew 10, we get Jesus saying, "Do not get any gold or silver or copper to take with you in your belts. No bag for the journey, no extra shirt or sandals, or a staff, for the worker is worth his keep." So this contradiction might seem really minuscule, really pointless. Yeah, who cares if he said take a staff or don't take a staff? But it's really about the fact that if these small sayings by Jesus, if these small instructions by Jesus were not recorded accurately, then how can we be sure that these big instructions that are related to our salvation can be recorded accurately? How do we know all these important teachings from God himself is recorded accurately? That's really the main crux of the issue here. So the next contradiction we have is Jesus' birth narratives, where he's born and he goes into Bethlehem or Nazareth, depending on which gospel you read. So in Luke, the narrative is that Joseph has to go to Bethlehem and register for a tax that Caesar Augustus is conducting over the whole world. He's taxing the whole world, and Joseph has to go back to Bethlehem and register for that tax. So he takes Mary with him, and they all go there, and Jesus is born in Bethlehem, and 1 month later they return to Nazareth. There's no mention of the killing of innocents. There's no mention of King Herod. There's no mention of a slaughter. It's just Joseph going to do the tax, and then Jesus is born in Bethlehem, and then they return to Nazareth. But then in Matthew's narrative of Jesus' birth, there's no tax mentioned whatsoever. There's the killing of innocents by King Herod, and then there is the fact that after Jesus is born, Joseph takes Mary and Jesus, and they flee to Egypt instead of going to Nazareth. So these narratives completely contradict, because how can Jesus be in two places at once? That can't be happening. So one of these narratives must be wrong. But how can we say either of them is wrong when it's in the Bible and inspired by God, and we believe that it's supposed to be true and everything in there is inerrant? But anyways, let's move on to the last of the two contradictions, which is Jesus' resurrection.
My disciples at Chapel Hill do this assignment every year. Just read what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John say about the resurrection and make a list of what each one says and compare your list. Who goes to the tomb? Is it one woman or several women? What are their names? It depends which gospel you read. Was the stone already rolled away before they got there? It depends which gospel you read. What did they see there? Did they see a man there? Did they see two men there, or did they see an angel there? It depends which gospel you read. What were they told to do? Depends which gospel you read.
Okay, I'm not just going to take your word for it. I'm going to go actually read it myself, and we're going to see if there's contradictions or not.
A few moments later.
Okay, so after reading it, I have made a chart of all the things that occur, all the facts, all the people that are there, the things that Jesus says, and here's the chart. I think just by looking at this, we can just see there's a lot of contradictions just in the resurrection narrative, which is supposed to be the most important narrative in Christianity, according to Paul. So this should be pretty much without error, because this is very important. This should be preserved by God perfectly. But it seems like there's a lot of contradictions here, especially with the things that Jesus says at the end. In 2 of the Gospels, he doesn't even show up. He doesn't even say anything to the women. And as we can see, Mary Magdalene is present in all these appearances. So Mary Magdalene is the one woman that's always there in all those Gospels. But then the weird thing is, when you have the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, it's not considered a canon. So it's interesting how the only person that was consistently there in all the Gospel narratives, their own gospel is not considered canon. And in terms of the events that happened during the resurrection narrative, it's just some of them are completely irreconcilable with one another. So in 3 of them, you have angels appearing at the tomb and talking with women as soon as the women realize that Jesus has gone from the tomb. But then in John, Peter and Simon both go to the tomb and they don't see any angels, they just see it empty. They go home confused, and then later Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene and says, "Go tell the disciples." And in Matthew, an earthquake happens, which is a pretty big event. I don't know how the other Gospels would have missed that. It didn't include that. But there's also the appearance of angels as looking like lightning. Their appearance is like lightning, which is not described that way in any other Gospel. And then you have this weird thing in Mark where the women are told to go tell about Jesus' resurrection to the other disciples by the angels, and then the women don't tell anyone. They don't tell anyone what's happened. But anyways, you guys can look at the graph yourselves and go read the gospel narratives yourselves and write down the things that you see in there, just like Bart Ehrman recommended. And there will be a lot of inconsistencies in there. I'm not saying they don't have answers in any way, but it's pretty weird that these things are still there. So then the last contradiction we have is kind of cheating, because Acts is not part of the gospel narratives, but still it's a big contradiction. And the contradiction is in Matthew 27, where Judas goes and hangs himself in order to kill himself. But then in Acts, we get a narrative about how Judas is walking in a field and then he falls headfirst and his guts explode out, and then he dies and there's blood all over the place, and it's called the field of blood and stuff like that. So Judas's death is not clear at all in any way, because Matthew is saying he hung himself, and then Acts it's saying that he fell over head first onto the ground and his intestines blew out and there was blood everywhere. So which is it? Did he hang himself or did his intestines fall out? Who knows? But overall, I'm not saying that these contradictions have no answers at all. There's definitely some answers. Doesn't mean that they're always good answers, but there's always contradictions that do have good answers and they do get answered. So it's not always that these contradictions are unanswerable. But it's pretty confusing that these would be in the Gospels and in the Bible in the first place, because in the Bible it says, in 1 Corinthians 14 it says, "For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all churches of the saints." So maybe there's a contradiction there too, because God is kind of the author of confusion here if he did really inspire this Bible and have this written. I think if the Bible is really inspired by God, there would be much less confusion and all these questions and all these weird objections wouldn't be coming up, but who knows? Anyways, I'm not saying this disproves Christianity, but it's just something to think about. Here's a new perspective. If you really thought the Bible was perfect, there's no issues at all. There's a lot of contradictions. But yeah, that's all for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Comment below. Let's have a discussion on these contradictions and what you think about them. Subscribe if you enjoy my content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.